Well, today we're looking at session number 64, entitled Marriage and Resurrection. Looking this time in Mark 12, verses 18 through 27, a few more verses than we've been doing lately. Well, Jesus had finished with those who challenged his authority. Remember, that was right after the cleansing of the temple, and included mostly chief priests, scribes, and elders, probably those from the Sanhedrin, however you want to say it, and likely the leadership too, or at least a segment of the leadership. But the efforts to discredit Jesus or diminish his popularity continued with three more questions from three different conspiring groups. In the last session, for example, the coalition of Pharisees and Herodians, the first group, the political opposites got together, and in their opposition to Jesus, they took their shot and about paying taxes to Caesar, and they failed because Jesus answered in a way that prevented them from taking advantage of his response to hurt his influence or his following. Now, in this second group, in this session, it's going to make a similar try at putting Jesus in hot water or even under arrest. These guys, called the Sadducees, Sadducees, they came with a ridiculous what-if situation that seems to have been an inside joke within their ranks. When we take a look at it, you will know why they considered it an inside joke. They knew, even themselves, that what they were proposing and challenging Jesus with was ridiculous. But they had to go at it. Let's look at Mark 12, verse 18. And some Sadducees, and now Mark inserts, who say there is no resurrection. So there is a place where they differ from the what's those other guys? The Pharisees. They differ from the Pharisees. The Pharisees believe there is a resurrection of the body. The Sadducees say there is no physical bodily resurrection. And they came to Jesus and began questioning him. And we'll look at what they said or what they questioned him about in a minute or two. They were evidently among the Sadducees, that is, evidently were among the aristocracy of Israel. They had significant wealth. They had significant influence. Some suppose they began with Zadok, Z-A-D-O-K, the high priest at the time of David. The Sadducees disappeared from the scene after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. So they went from the time of David forward to AD 70, probably about 1,000 years. There were people called Sadducees. The failure to believe in a bodily resurrection was only one of their misunderstandings. They said there's no future in judgment. They said there are no such things as angels. And they said there are no spiritual beings. Look at Acts 23 verses 8. It says something similar about the Sadducees. And this would be Paul primarily at this point. Acts 23:8. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So, on the spiritual side, these guys were on opposite poles. The Sadducees taught that body and soul is a unity. Destroy the body and the soul is also destroyed. That's something today we call annihilism, which says that when you die, that's the end of everything. There is no more conscious existence after physical death. Now, many of the Sadducees were priests. As a matter of fact, most of the priests came from Aaron. Well, all the priests had to come from Aaron, and the chief priests high up in the hierarchy of Israel were primarily Sadducees, but they worked cooperatively with the Romans. So while they were ahead in some sense of the religious segment of Israel, they wanted to cooperate with the Romans. Why? Because if they lacked cooperation, they could lose all of their influence, including the nation itself. They accepted only Moses' 5 books from the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, some call it the Torah, the first 5 books. And you know what those 5 books are. And from those 5 books, they concluded that there was no evidence for an afterlife that included bodily resurrection. They included there were no angels. And that one's a little harder to see how they bought out of Moses' books, because Moses speaks of angels or angelic presence when the 10 Commandments were received. Let's jump to Acts 4 and the first 2 verses. Acts 4, 1-2. And as they, and this was Peter and John at this time, as Peter and John were speaking to the people, the priests and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came upon them. There are those guys coming now again. This was after Pentecost, even. It was still existed. Remember, they existed. Pentecost would have been about AD 30, 33. It was in AD 70, about 35 to 40 years later, that the Sadducees disappeared. So they were still here after Pentecost. They came upon Peter and John, being greatly disturbed, the Sadducees and such, because they, Peter and John, were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus, what? The resurrection from the dead. So Peter and John, the apostles, were preaching a bodily resurrection. Let's jump from chapter 4 to chapter 5, looking at verses 17 and 18. But the high priest, he definitely would have been a Sadducee, rose up along with all of his associates, that is, the sect of the Sadducees. So all these Sadducees got up together. They were filled with jealousy, and they laid the hands on the apostles, Peter, John, so forth, and put them in a public jail. So Peter and John are jailed by the Sadducees because of what they were saying and what they were teaching, and the people were listening. So, but now let's move to the what-if situation that they presented to Jesus on the way to their related question. They believe they're teaching Jesus here, I think. Mark 12:19. Teacher, there's that flattery again. They don't believe in him as a teacher at all. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves behind a wife, but leaves no child, no heir, his brother should take the wife and raise up offspring to his brother. Translation, if a man dies, leaving no firstborn son, the brother should take the wife and procreate with her to raise up a son who will be considered the son of the dead brother. That's going to be the central aspect of the thing they get to as the question when they get there. Keep in mind, they do not believe in a physical afterlife following a bodily resurrection. So they're setting up something that's supposed to happen that has a relation to a dead person, but not a physical resurrection. Most of the population, by the way, did not like the Sadducees. A matter of fact, some wag who understood that said something somewhat humorously. That's why they're called Sadducee. That's why they were sad, you see. Sadyousee. What they were describing is called a levirate, Levirate, a levirate marriage. And they're setting up a story they know is absurd, absolutely impossible, and outside their belief system. So, what is levirate marriage? Well, we can see a part of it, at least, in Deuteronomy 25. Notice, this is back in the books of Moses. This was a book the Sadducees accepted. When brothers live together, and this is starting in chapter 25, verses 5 and 6, when brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. They're wanting to keep everything inside the same tribe. If it was of Judah, if the man was from the tribe of Judah, the woman now has to marry another Judean. That's all. She can't marry someone from Gad or Dan or Benjamin. She has to marry a Judean. But this goes beyond that now. And here's what it says. Her husband's brother shall go into her, and we're talking here about a physical, sexual relationship, and take her to himself as a wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn out of that brother and the other dead man's wife, and it shall be that the firstborn, meaning firstborn son, whom she bears, shall assume the name of his dead brother. So this son is to be considered a son of the dead brother. Why? That his name may not be blotted out from Israel. This son will continue that family line in Israel, which has other considerations. It was designed by God to do at least three things, I think. Number one, provide for the widow, because she would have a brother taking care of her, and she would have then sons, one or more, to provide for her. It would produce a son who would be considered the dead man's offspring and would continue the dead man's family line. And here is another thing. It would keep properties in the clans according to the original allotments made through Joshua after the conquest of Canaan. Because remember the Jubilee? Every 50 years, all property was to return to the original clan to whom it was allotted. So, that was a third issue here. Not only to provide for the widow, to produce a son who's going to continue the family line, it will help keep the property alignments as they're supposed to be. Makes sense, right? In actuality, levirate marriage may not even have been practiced during Jesus' times. It's adding to the ridiculous situation they set up. But it didn't matter to the Sadducees, who seem to have become solid enemies of Jesus after the temple cleansing last Monday. If you want to see levirate marriage in play in the genealogical line of Jesus, check Genesis 38. That's the story of Judah and Tamar. Now, let's look at what the Sadducees' what-if story is to mean. Here we're going to look at Mark 12, verses 20, 21, and 22. There were 7 brothers, okay? And the first took a wife and died, leaving no offspring. So now the levirate marriage scenario is in play. And the second one took her, the second brother of the 7, took her and died, leaving no offspring behind. Second, the levirate marriage did not produce the son designed to produce. And the third likewise. So the third son of the third brother of the 7 did the same thing. He took the woman, and so all this is going to go on. Here it is. And so all 7 left no offspring. What's the implication? All 7 brothers, one after the other, probably from the oldest to the youngest, had her as a wife, but none of them produced a son. Last of all, the woman died also. So now the 7 brothers are dead. The woman who was had by all 7 brothers is dead, and there is no son. No continuation of that family line. So here's the question in verse 23. In the resurrection, which they don't believe in at all, in the resurrection, when they rise again, which they don't believe, which one's wife will she be? For all 7 had her as a wife. You see the ridiculousness of this. There are several. One is they don't believe in the resurrection, so they believe the 7 brothers were no longer in existence. The wife is nowhere in existence. Whose wife will no existence be? It doesn't make any sense, right? According to their beliefs. But what are they saying? They said, look, Jesus, if you think there is a resurrection now, you have to answer this question. If there were, we don't think there was, but if there were, then somebody would have to have her as a wife. Which one of the 7? But Jesus is going to point out to them they have further problems. It wasn't that they've set up a ridiculous situation, which theoretically is possible, except they don't recognize the possibility of the need for an answer for it. So, what were they trying to do? They were trying to accomplish one thing with this ridiculous story and the question which follows. They knew it was a sham, but they intended for it to make the belief in the bodily resurrection unsustainable. Unsustainable? They didn't believe that the belief in the body resurrection could make this do. And because they said, you can't tell me whose wife she would be. But if there is a resurrection, somebody's got to have her as wife. Those are the assumptions that aren't given outrightly. They anticipated that Jesus' answer would lead to what's called a reductio absurdum. It is a statement that says, if this is true, then it's going to lead to an impossible conclusion. Where does the conclusion come from? The assumption that bodily resurrection was true. They're saying, Jesus, when you answer this question, we're going to prove to you that's ridiculous. So the question might be rephrased this way. If bodily resurrection is true, isn't it impossible to answer my question? You can't answer that. They wanted to make ridiculous, or they wanted to make ridiculous belief in bodily resurrection. They want little ridiculous stuff going on. I can't even think of the version of ridiculous. Ridicule? They want to ridicule Jesus' belief in bodily resurrection. And maybe I finally found it. But Jesus had an in-your-face answer. What was his answer? You're plainly wrong. You are ignorant where it counts. Just look what he said in verse 24 of chapter 12. Jesus said to them, the Sadducees, is this not the reason you are mistaken? He says, let me start. I'm going to give you the reason why you're off base. Here's the reason. That you do not understand the scriptures, part 1. Second part, or you do not understand the power of God. So I'm going to show you 2 things where you are wrong. You don't understand Scripture. You don't understand what God is capable of. He told them they're wrong again on 2 counts at least. You don't know the scriptures correctly. You don't know God's power and what is possible with him. And explained then for everyone who was there. And remember, there would have been crowds, more crowds than typical, because it was almost Passover. And he explained for everyone to hear in verse 25. For when they rise from the dead, the 7 brothers and the wife, they neither marry nor are given in marriage. So he said, your whole assumption setting this stupid thing up is wrong. There's not any marriage in heaven. But they are like angels in heaven. Meaning what? They're spiritual beings. They will not die. They will be eternal. There is no reason for the purpose of marriage, which is intimacy and procreation. There's no need for that. The relationships will be different. In eternity, future relationships will be different. There will be no marriage relationships. There will be no exclusive relationships. Everybody is going to be in relation to everyone in complete knowledge. There will be no sexual relationships, but relationships of a better type will be brought about by the power of God. Marriage is suitable and necessary for an earthly existence where death is found, and that yielding intimate companionship, that's what marriage does, and provides procreation to guarantee the continuation of the human race as long as time exists. Angels are eternal spirits. Death does not exist among them. Procreation, therefore, is unnecessary. Angelic relationships are of a different order as they serve God. But then Jesus didn't stop. He went on to deal with the bodily resurrection itself. He said, your first error is you don't understand what heaven's like from Scripture. So he didn't deal with bodily resurrection there. What he dealt with was the fact that God's power permitted different kinds of relationships to exist. And this time, though, he's going to go right to Moses' writings to answer their question. Let's go to verse 26. But regarding, this is Jesus continuing to speak, regarding the fact that the dead rise again, have you not read in the book of Moses? He's rubbing their face into it. You say these are all that are Scripture. Haven't you read in your own belief system of Scriptures, in the passage about the burning bush, which is Exodus 3, by the way, how God spoke to Moses, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and I am the God of Isaac, and I am the God of Jacob. What's the key in that verse? I am, not I was or I used to be. If God is still the God of Abraham, then Abraham is still alive, as well as Isaac and as Jacob. So their main 3 forefathers are still alive, Jesus said, as implied by God's response to Moses. And by the way, who does Exodus 3 say is in that burning bush talking? Malach Yahweh, the angel of Jehovah. So, but again, now Jesus has in mind, of course, what about Moses and Elijah? Peter, James, and John saw them at the Transfiguration. They must still be alive also, and alive in a form that allows them to be recognized. Then, here comes the fait accompli, verse 27. He, this is Yahweh now, is not the God, this is Jesus still speaking, and he's making the issue I've just made. Yahweh is not the God of the dead, but he is the God of the living. You are greatly mistaken. In other words, he said it twice now. He's told the Sadducees, you're wrong. And he says, the ones you say that are no longer in existence, no, they're alive. Paul also weighed in on the question of resurrection of the body in 1 Corinthians 15. In particular, I'm going to read verses 39 and 40. All flesh is not the same flesh. We got that, right? There is one flesh of men, there's another flesh of beasts, there's another flesh of birds, there's another flesh of fish. So he said, I can show you at least 4 different categories of different flesh. There are also, though, he said, heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. This the Sadducees had missed. But the glory of the heavenly is one, and the glory of the earth is another. He's saying there are 2 bodies, the earthly body and the heavenly body, and they're different. They will be recognizable as Jesus was recognizable, but they are different. Faith in bodily resurrection, what is it? It's really faith in the power and goodness of Yahweh. Once God calls someone to himself, he establishes a relationship, that relationship forever. That relationship between the one God calls to himself will never change. It is a relationship between God and a human with a resurrected body designed to last eternally. No argument, hypocritical or not, is going to change that truth, because that is God's truth. Well, next time, where we're going next time, we're going to look at the 3rd attempt to trap Jesus with a question. We've looked at 2 of them, the Pharisees and the Herodians, then the Sadducees. But we're going to look at the 3rd attempt, and I'm going to give you a clue about it. I'm looking at Matthew 22, verses 33, 34, and 35. It's a short passage. And when the multitude heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. That's it, Jesus' teaching. Matthew is looking at this same thing that we just looked with the Sadducees. But when the Pharisees heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, in other words, but when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had shut the mouths of the Sadducees and showed how ridiculous they were, they gathered themselves together, the Pharisees did, And one of them, a Pharisee, a lawyer, which would make him a scribe, a teacher of the law, asked him a question testing him. So we're going back. The next guy in, one guy is going to come with a question. That guy is a Pharisee. He's a lawyer. He's a scribe. He is one teaching Scripture. And he's going to come and try and trap Jesus. So they've gone now to the top line of a guy who should be able to trap Jesus if it's possible. Guess what? The Pharisees are going to be back at it again, next time with a question from, as I said, a top person in the Scripture. But like we know, it ain't gonna work. As a matter of fact, the scribe, he this time may change his mind.